A deafening roar. Darkness swallows the mine as rocks collapse. The air fills with choking dust. Men scream. Amidst the chaos, Ethan Cole, a rugged miner often mocked as rough and dumb, pulls himself from the rubble. Blood runs down his forehead, but his eyes blaze with determination. Everyone thinks he's just muscle, but once, long ago, he studied geology before life dragged him into the mines. This is his moment. The roar came like the end of the world. It was not a sound so much as a shuddering force that shook the marrow of every bone in Ethan Cole's body. The mine groaned as if it were alive, timbers splintering like ribs breaking, stone shrieking as it tore free. The lanterns swung violently before most of them smashed against the walls, and then the lights went out. In the choking dark, the air filled with dust so thick Ethan could not tell if he was breathing or drowning in earth. He hit the ground hard, cheeks scraping rock, ribs compressing beneath the weight of falling debris. His lungs screamed for air, but when he tried to inhale, he swallowed grit. Somewhere near him men were shouting, panicked voices cracking into screams. A crash silenced one of them instantly. Then came another roar, and the tunnel shook as though the mountain were settling into place on their backs. For a moment, all Ethan could do was hold on to the earth beneath him, his fingers clawing into the dirt as though the ground itself might carry him to safety. His heart hammered so loudly in his skull that it almost drowned out the collapse. And then, silence. Terrible, heavy silence, broken only by a few muffled groans and the dry coughing of men trying to breathe through lungs coated in dust. He rolled onto his side, his head swimming. Warmth trickled down from his forehead into his eye. Blood mixed with dust and made everything sting. He groped blindly until his hand met a timber beam still wedged into the earth, and with a grunt he pulled himself upright. His chest rose and fell too fast, but he forced himself to steady. The men needed steadiness. Sound off. His voice, roughened by smoke and grit, carried through the void. Who's alive? There was hesitation, then the cough-ridden answers of men who were terrified even to hear their own voices. Here, someone wheezed. My leg. God, my leg's pinned. Help me. I can't move. I'm here. Too few voices. Far too few. Ethan swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. He could not stop to count the missing names. Not now. Stay calm, he barked, more firmly this time, the way his father once used to call over the roar of machines in the steel mill. We're still here. Keep your wits. We'll get out of this. Somewhere in the dark, flint struck steel. A weak flame flickered, feeding on oil, and one of the surviving lanterns came alive. Its glow barely reached the walls, but it was enough to show faces, blood-streaked, dust-pale, eyes wide and wild. The men looked around, and, almost by instinct, their gazes landed on Ethan. Not because he was their captain, he wasn't, but he was the one standing when the rest were broken or crouched on the ground. His broad chest rose with controlled breaths, his expression grim but focused. For years they had called him the Brute, mocked his scarred knuckles and quiet manner. Now, when everything had collapsed, it was the Brute who was steady. Beside him, a wiry man named Morales staggered forward, one arm cradled against his ribs. His eyes darted around the mangled shaft. The whole damn tunnel's gone, he rasped. We're buried alive. Ethan squinted upward. The ceiling pressed down with oppressive closeness, dirt and rock packed where the tunnel mouth had been. The lantern flame trembled, its glow revealing dust swirling in the stale air. He felt the mountain above them, thousands of tons of earth pressing like a coffin lid. But beneath the despair that threatened to choke him, something else stirred. Something he had not let himself feel in years. Memory. He had once studied these rocks. Back before the mines, back before his father's accident had torn him out of college and thrown him into a world of debts and responsibility, Ethan had lived for stone. He could still see himself in the lecture halls, mapping strata with a steady hand, listening as his professor described the way the earth folded and fractured. Geology had been his language, once. He had traded it for sweat and exhaustion. Yet now, in the black tomb of the mine, the stones spoke to him again. We're not dead yet, he said. One of the younger miners lay pinned under a splintered beam, his face contorted with pain. Ethan bent down, braced his shoulder beneath the wood, and with a grunt of effort forced it upward just enough for the man to crawl free. The shaft above groaned ominously, but held. The survivors clustered together. Ethan counted quickly, 13. More than he had feared, fewer than he had prayed for. A stout man named Travis spat blood into the dirt and scowled. What now, genius? You plan to dig through solid rock with your bare damn hands? Best thing is we sit tight. They'll be digging from the outside already. Just gotta wait. Ethan shook his head. No, you don't understand. This shaft was deep. Too deep. Rescue could take days. We don't have days. He lifted the lantern toward the ceiling. The flame wavered weakly, shrinking as if gasping for breath. Look at it. Air's already thin. Every minute we sit here, we lose more. Wait long enough, we'll suffocate before they even find where to start digging. The men murmured anxiously. Travis crossed his arms. You don't know that. I do. Ethan replied, voice firm. He gestured toward the walls, the lines of rock almost invisible in the flickering glow. These layers tell a story. The collapse sealed this shaft. No airflow. We need to find a natural fault, maybe a fissure leading upward. If we head east, there should be one. Travis laughed harshly. Listen to the ox preach. You think you're some professor? You're just muscle with a pick. Don't act like you're smarter than the rest of us. Ethan had heard it all before. The insults. The mockery. He was used to being thought of as little more than a strong back, a rough voice, and fists that never lost a fight. He let the sneer roll off him. You can stay, he said quietly. But if you do, you'll die here. I'm going east. The silence that followed was almost worse than the collapse. The men shifted uneasily, torn between distrust and the raw instinct to follow anyone who sounded certain. Finally Morales stepped forward, his battered face pale but determined. I'll follow. Another man rose. Then another. Even Travis, after a muttered curse, lifted his pack and moved to join the group. Ethan led, lantern in hand, his other palm pressed to the rock like a blind man reading Braille. This vein's angling up, he explained as they moved. See that line? Water used to flow here. Follow the fracture, and maybe it'll take us closer to the surface. Few understood his words, but his voice itself was an anchor. In the dark, certainty was the brightest light. They pressed deeper, the air growing heavier, each breath harder than the last. Dust clung to their tongues, sweat streaked with grime ran into their eyes. Now and then the earth groaned above them, and pebbles rattled down. The men flinched at every sound, but Ethan pressed on steadily. Then they reached a wall of collapsed stone, a dead end. The men sagged in despair. It's over, Travis muttered. We're finished. Ethan crouched, pressing his ear to the rock. He rapped it with his knuckles, listening, then closed his eyes. Beneath the solid weight, there was a faint hollowness, an echo. The tunnel continued on the other side. We dig, he said simply. With what strength they had, the miners set to work. Picks rang weakly against stone, shovels scraped dirt, and bare hands clawed where tools could not reach. Nails split, knuckles bled, but the rhythm of labor was a comfort, a weapon against the despair that threatened to paralyze them. Ethan dug with them, every muscle straining, sweat stinging his cut forehead. He was not their leader in title, but in that moment, he was their engine. Hours blurred together. The lantern burned lower. Hope thinned with the air. Just as their strength began to falter, the wall gave way. Dirt spilled inward, revealing a jagged gap into another shaft. A whisper of fresher air flowed through, cool against Ethan's sweat-slick skin. He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and for the first time since the collapse, felt a fierce surge of joy. We're not done yet, he murmured. One by one the men crawled through the narrow opening, their bodies scraping rock, their lungs desperate for the thin stream of cleaner air. They emerged into another tunnel, older, rougher, but sloping upward. Relief flickered among them, laughter breaking raggedly from cracked throats. For the first time, hope felt possible. But Ethan knew better than to celebrate. This was only the beginning. The shaft grew tighter, forcing them to crawl. Wounded men stumbled, and Ethan bore their weight on his broad shoulders. They pressed forward until the air shifted, dampness seeping into stone. Ethan ran his hand along the wall and felt moisture. Water, he said. He cupped his palms beneath the trickle and drank. The others followed, greedy with thirst. Some laughed for the first time, faces bright with fleeting joy. Yet Ethan's eyes narrowed. Water meant life, but it also meant danger. A fissure carrying water could mean an underground stream, or worse, a flood ready to break loose. He kept the thought to himself. Moments later, a sound reached them. Not the drip of water, not the settling of rock. A low, distant thudding, echoing faintly through the stone. The men froze, lantern light catching the whites of their eyes. "What is it?" Morales whispered. Ethan cocked his head, straining to listen. It might have been the pounding of drills from rescue crews far above. Or it might have been something else entirely, something moving deep within the bowels of the mountain. He couldn't tell, but he knew one thing for certain. The earth wasn't finished testing them. The tunnel grew narrower as they pressed forward, walls dripping with moisture that glistened faintly in the waning lantern light. Every man felt the press of stone above and around them. The weight of the earth like a coffin lid lowered slowly onto their chests. Their breaths came ragged, strained, each inhalation dragging less oxygen than the one before. Ethan Cole walked at the front, his shoulders hunched, one large hand brushing the wall as though reading the stone like braille. His other hand held the lantern high, its flames sputtering and shrinking, as if it too were starving for air. He did not show the weariness that knotted his muscles or the burn in his lungs. The others were watching him too closely. If he faltered, they all would. Behind him, someone coughed, a dry rasp that echoed far louder than it should have in the cramped space. Then another cough joined it, weaker, and when Ethan turned he saw Harlan, one of the older men, sagging against the wall. His eyes were glassy, his face ashen beneath streaks of dirt, lips tinged faint blue. Morales crouched to support him, whispering something Ethan couldn't hear. Ethan knelt, placing a steadying hand on the man's shoulder. "Breathe slow," he said. "In through your nose, out your mouth. Don't fight it. You're stronger than you think." Harlan's chest rattled, but after a moment he nodded faintly, eyes flickering with fragile willpower. The others had paused, watching with unease that mirrored their own fear. Every one of them felt the same suffocating weight in their lungs, though some hid it better. Ethan knew the signs too well. Air was dwindling, and it was not only Harlan who was on borrowed time. Travis's voice broke the fragile silence. "This is madness," he snapped, his words harsh in the tight space. His broad face glistened with sweat, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're dragging us deeper into the mountain when we should stay put. If we sit still, they'll find us. If we keep moving, we'll all choke before we get anywhere." Ethan rose slowly, meeting the other man's glare. "If we stay, we die here. No one will reach us before the air's gone." Travis's eyes narrowed. "And you know that how? Because you once read a few books before you dropped out? You're no savior, Cole. You're a hammer with arms attached. Stop pretending you're more." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. "Because I've seen it before." The words carried more weight than a shout. The others stared, listening. Years ago, during a smaller cave-in, Ethan and two others had been trapped for nearly a day. He had watched the lantern flame shrink, had felt the press of suffocation until the rescue came minutes before the end. He remembered the panic, the blackness around the edges of vision, the final desperate gasps. That memory, buried for years, now stood like a warning in the stale air. "We keep moving," he said again, his tone final. The men shifted uneasily, but none argued further. Even Travis only muttered something under his breath before shouldering his pack again. Time blurred. The darkness was unbroken save for the flickering light. Ethan lost count of how long they trudged through the narrow shaft, stooping lower and lower until their backs ached. The men stumbled often, hands scraping against jagged walls. Their thirst grew worse, their tongues like cracked leather. Every cough seemed sharper, harsher, and the silence that followed was worse than noise. At last Morales, trying to cut the suffocating quiet, asked, "Cole, it's true you studied rocks once? Before the mines?" Ethan hesitated. He rarely spoke of the past. It was a burden he carried quietly, a life he had buried as deeply as the mountain now buried him. But the men's eyes turned toward him, weary and desperate for distraction. A story was a rope to cling to. "I studied geology," Ethan said finally, his voice low. "University in Denver. I wanted to map mountains, maybe teach. I thought I'd spend my life with stone as my partner, not my master. He paused, the words heavy on his tongue. Then my father died. Steel mill accident. My mother was sick. 2 sisters to care for. I left school. Took the mines instead. It wasn't a choice. It was survival. The men exchanged glances. Some looked surprised, others guilty for the years of mocking him as nothing more than a brute. Even Travis faltered, though he covered it with a scoff. Figures. Thought you were too good for real work. Then gave up when life got hard. Ethan didn't rise to the bait. His past was not for Travis's judgment. But he saw how the others regarded him differently now, how the glimmers of respect cut through their fear. He pushed forward. The tunnel groaned suddenly, and dust rained down. The men froze as a timber somewhere ahead cracked sharply, echoing like a gunshot. Ethan's stomach clenched. "Move," he shouted. They scrambled, stumbling forward as rocks shifted above. A young miner, Hal, panicked. His eyes wide with terror, he bolted toward a narrow side tunnel, ignoring Ethan's warning cry. The instant his foot struck the ground, the roof above gave way. Ethan lunged, seizing Hal's arm, and yanked with everything he had. Stone crashed down where the boy had stood, sealing the passage in a heartbeat. The air filled with dust and coughing. Hal collapsed against Ethan's chest, sobbing. I thought I was done." "You would have been," Ethan said sharply, holding him at arm's length. His voice cracked like a whip. "You run blind. You die. You stay with me. You live. Understand?" Hal nodded frantically, eyes wide. The others were silent, shaken. Even Travis had nothing to say until at last he muttered bitterly. "So what? Now we bow to you? One save and you're a damn hero?" Ethan's patience snapped. He strode forward, grabbed Travis by the collar, and slammed him against the wall. The lantern light cut across his scarred face, his eyes burning. "I don't care what you call me. I don't care if you hate me. But if you disobey down here, you get people killed. I won't let that happen. You want to prove I'm wrong? Fine. Do it when we're out. Until then, you follow." For a long, tense moment, Travis glared back. Then he looked away. Ethan released him, stepping back slowly. The silence that followed was heavier than the stone itself. The group moved with greater caution after that. They spoke little. Their bodies dragged. Their steps faltered, but no one dared stray again. Ethan felt their exhaustion, felt his own body screaming in protest. His shoulder throbbed from yanking Hal. His throat burned with every rasping breath. But he forced himself to move steadily. If he faltered, they would crumble. Hours, or what felt like hours, later, the sound came. At first it was faint, a whisper almost lost in the wheeze of their breathing. Ethan lifted a hand, signaling them to stop. They strained to listen. Water. A steady trickle, dripping rhythmically from somewhere ahead. Hope surged through their veins like fire. They hurried forward until Ethan pressed his palm to the wall and felt moisture slick against his skin. He lowered his lips to the rock, tasting the faint metallic tang. He drank greedily, then stepped aside. The men fell upon the trickle like starving animals. They cupped it into their mouths, splashed it onto cracked lips. Some laughed hoarsely, the sound like the ghosts of joy. For a moment, they were not dying. But Ethan's relief was tempered by unease. Water meant a fissure, a path carved through stone, but it could also mean danger. Underground rivers flooded without warning, swept men away into darkness where no light or breath could follow. He did not voice it. They needed hope, even if it carried its own peril. The lantern sputtered again. The flame shrank, threatening to die. A hush fell over the group as they watched the last of their fragile light tremble. Darkness seemed to press closer, eager to reclaim them. Then, through the silence, came another sound. Low, rhythmic. A deep booming that seemed to vibrate through the rock itself. The men froze, water dripping from their hands, eyes wide in the dim glow. "Rescue drills," Morales whispered, his voice trembling with desperate hope. Ethan cocked his head, listening. The sound was steady, far away but unmistakable. It could have been the pounding of men and machines digging toward them from the surface. Or it could have been something else entirely, the mountain shifting again, preparing to close its jaws. He could not tell, but he knew one thing. The earth was not finished testing them. And whether the sound was salvation or doom, they had no choice but to walk toward it. The booming echoes grew stronger as they pressed on, sometimes fading until they wondered if they had only imagined them, then returning again like the beating of some great underground heart. Each sound tightened the knots in their stomachs. Hope warred with fear, each man desperate to believe the noise belonged to rescuers above, but unable to silence the dread that it might be nothing more than the mountain shifting its weight again. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them into single file, their bodies brushing the damp stone. The lantern light barely stretched far enough to illuminate the man directly behind Ethan. Beyond that, only shadow and the steady rasp of breath and coughs. The flames sputtered with every exhale, weak and trembling. Their world had shrunk to a swaying halo of light, the smell of sweat and dust, the sound of boots dragging against stone. Travis muttered curses behind him. His voice had grown harsher, more venomous with every step. We're walking to our graves. Every damn one of us. And we're letting a washed-up student lead us straight in. Ethan ignored him at first, focusing instead on the layers of stone beneath his hand. There was a tilt, a shift that told him the fault was angling upward still. But Travis's words cut deeper into the silence until they lodged in every man's ear. You hear me? Travis demanded. We're following a dreamer who couldn't even stick it out at school. He abandoned that life, and now he's playing hero with ours. Ethan stopped. He turned slowly, the lantern light throwing shadows across his scarred face. His voice was low but carried the weight of stone. I didn't abandon it. I traded it. My family had nothing. My sisters would have starved. So I chose the mines. Don't you dare call that quitting. Travis stepped closer, eyes burning. And what about now? You think you're some savior because you remember a few scraps of knowledge? You're gonna get us killed, Cole. All of us. The tension snapped like a wire. Travis shoved him hard. Ethan staggered back against the wall, the lantern jerking wildly. Dust shook loose from the ceiling. The others shouted in panic. Stop. Morales barked. You'll bring it down on us. But Travis lunged again, fist swinging. Ethan caught at midair, twisting his arm until the man grunted in pain. He pushed him back against the rock, the lantern's glow painting them both in sharp relief. For a moment, it looked as though Ethan might strike. But instead, he leaned in close, voice a growl. You want to fight me, fine. Do it outside, under the sun. But down here, every second we waste brings us closer to death. You don't have to trust me, but you will not stop me. Travis's chest heaved. He glared at Ethan, hatred radiating from him. But he said nothing. Ethan released him, stepping back. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the ragged breaths of men who knew how close they had come to disaster. They moved again, more carefully this time. Ethan led them around a bend where the rock shifted strangely. The wall glittered faintly in the lantern glow, streaks of mineral veining through the stone. The others muttered nervously, unsure. But Ethan felt a spark of certainty. He pressed his hand against the shimmer, tracing the line with his fingertips. This is quartz, he murmured. Formed in a fracture. Means we're close to a fault line. If we follow it, it should open up. Or cave in on our heads, Travis snapped. But Morales squinted at the faint gleam. He's right. My uncle mined quartz. Said it always showed up where the earth cracked. Maybe he knows what he's talking about. The others murmured their reluctant agreement. For the first time, Ethan saw something shift in their eyes. Not just desperation, but trust. Fragile, hesitant, but real. They followed the quartz vein, crawling where the tunnel narrowed, scraping their elbows raw against jagged stone. Twice the roof groaned above them, sending showers of pebbles down. Each time, they froze, hearts hammering, until the earth settled again. Then disaster struck. They reached a section where the tunnel opened wider, but the floor dropped suddenly into a jagged pit. Ethan tested the edge with his boot, the stone crumbling dangerously. He turned to warn the others, but one of the men, Reed, exhausted and stumbling, moved too quickly. His foot slipped. With a cry, he tumbled forward into the pit. The lantern light caught him just in time for them to see his body crash against jagged rocks, his scream echoing up the shaft. He dangled there, one arm clutching a sharp outcrop, legs kicking into the void. Reed, someone shouted. Without hesitation, Ethan dropped to his stomach, sliding forward until his chest hung over the edge. Grab my hand, he roared. Reed's eyes were wild with terror. Blood streaked his face from a gash on his forehead. His grip was slipping. Ethan stretched farther, his shoulders screaming in pain, his fingers brushing reeds. He lunged, catching the man's wrist just as his other hand gave way. The jolt nearly pulled Ethan into the pit with him. Morales and Hal lunged forward, grabbing Ethan's legs, anchoring him as he strained. Pull! Ethan growled through clenched teeth. His muscles screamed, veins bulging as he dragged Reed upward inch by inch. Reed sobbed, his free hand clawing desperately at the edge until at last they hauled him over. The men collapsed together, gasping. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then someone whispered, "He saved him." The words spread like a spark through dry tinder. Reed, shaking and bleeding, clutched Ethan's arm as though it were the only thing tethering him to life. Even Travis's glare wavered, the hatred in his eyes replaced by something closer to grudging respect, or at least silence. They rested briefly, then pressed onward. The quartz vein widened, leading them into a chamber larger than any they had yet seen. The ceiling arched high above, disappearing into shadow. Their lantern's glow barely touched it. The sound of dripping water echoed here, louder, steady. Then came another noise. A rushing, distant roar. The men froze. The sound was unmistakable now, water, moving fast and strong. An underground river. Relief surged through some of them. It could lead out, Morales said, his voice trembling with hope. Rivers flow somewhere. To the surface. But Ethan felt unease. Rivers flowed, yes, but not always to freedom. Some vanished deeper into the earth, into caverns where no man could follow. And even if it was a path upward, the water could sweep them to their deaths. Still, there was no choice. The air was thinning, their lantern almost gone. The river was hope, and hope was enough. They stood at the edge of the chamber, the roar of water echoing through the darkness. The men looked to Ethan again, their faces gaunt, their eyes desperate. And he knew what he had to do. "Stay close," he said. "Whatever waits ahead, we face it together." The words echoed off the stone, swallowed by the roar of unseen water. And then they moved toward it, into the darkness where salvation and doom waited side by side. The roar of water grew louder as they pressed deeper, a low thunder that seemed to shake the very walls around them. Each step brought them closer to it, the damp air growing cooler, fresher, though tinged with a metallic bite that made their throats burn. The lantern swung in Ethan's hand, its weak flame shivering as though afraid of what lay ahead. Behind him, the men stumbled forward, exhaustion etched into every line of their faces, but hope glimmering faintly in their eyes for the first time since the collapse. When they rounded the bend, the tunnel opened into a vast cavern, its ceiling lost to shadow. The roar became deafening, echoing in waves until they had to shout to hear one another. At the far end, black water surged from the rocks, foaming white where it struck jagged edges before plunging into a torrent that disappeared into darkness. The underground river, wide and swift, cut the chamber in two. Some of the men gasped, their faces breaking into smiles. "Water," Morales said, his voice almost reverent. He staggered to the edge and dropped to his knees, scooping the cold liquid into his mouth. The others followed, drinking greedily, washing dust from their cracked lips and parched throats. For a moment, the chamber was filled with the sound of slurping, coughing, even ragged laughter. But Ethan did not laugh. He crouched by the river's edge, dipping his hand into the current. The water was icy, pulling sharply at his skin, moving faster than he liked. He studied the flow, the way it bent and curved. Rivers had mouths, but they also had graves. Some ended in deep caverns where the water vanished forever into the bowels of the earth. He could not be sure which kind this was. Still, he inhaled deeply. The air here was better. Moist, yes, but fresher. His chest expanded more easily, and he saw the same relief on the others' faces. This river had carved a passage. Perhaps, just perhaps, it could carry them out. Travis broke the moment with a harsh laugh. "Well, Professor, you gonna tell us this is salvation now? Or should we sit here and wait for the current to drag us to hell?" Ethan ignored the jibe, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the rushing water. He stood, pointing to a section of rock where the ceiling dipped lower. "Look there." The current's faster means it's narrowing. If we follow it, there's a chance it leads upward. A chance. Travis sneered. That's all we've had since the start. Chances. Half-baked guesses. You keep rolling dice with our lives. The words might have cut deeper earlier, but not now. The others had seen too much. Reed, still limping from his near fall into the pit, shook his head. You'd rather sit here and rot? The man's been right so far. We'd be dead back there if not for him. Murmurs of agreement rose. Even Hal, pale and trembling, nodded fiercely. I'll follow him. Better to move than choke in the dark. Travis spat into the river, but said nothing more. Ethan began leading them along the riverbank, where the rocks were slick with spray. The sound swallowed their footsteps, each man's breath loud in his own ears. They moved cautiously, clinging to the walls where the path narrowed, their boots slipping dangerously on wet stone. More than once, someone staggered, and hands shot out to steady them. The current below roared hungrily, eager for a misstep. The path ended at a jagged wall where the river pressed against stone, leaving no more than a thin ledge. They hesitated, fear flickering in their eyes. The only way forward was to cross. Ethan tested the ledge with his weight, the stone slick beneath his boots. He pressed one hand to the wall, an inch sideways. The current rushed so close it sprayed his legs, threatening to sweep him away if he slipped. He moved slowly, every muscle tight with focus, until he reached a wider patch of ground on the other side. He turned back. One at a time, he shouted over the roar. They came, trembling, their faces pale. Morales crossed next, muttering prayers under his breath. Reed followed, wincing with every step. Hal nearly lost his footing, his arms pinwheeling wildly until Ethan lunged forward, gripping his hand and yanking him to safety. One by one, they made it across. All but Travis. He stood at the far side, glaring across the water. You lead us across this, and next it'll be lava, or a pit, or a wall of rock. You're not leading us out. You're leading us deeper. Ethan's patience was worn to its core. Then stay, he snapped. Stay and wait for air that won't come. For a long moment, Travis's face twisted with rage. Then he stepped onto the ledge. Halfway across, his boot slipped. His body slammed against the wall, arms flailing. The men gasped. Ethan dropped to his knees, reaching out, but Travis managed to clutch the rock, pulling himself shakily to the other side. When he stood beside Ethan, his eyes burned with humiliation. Don't think this makes you right, he spat. But his voice trembled. They moved on. The tunnel twisted, narrowing again. The roar of the river echoed behind them as they climbed a slope slick with moisture. The air was fresher still, though heavy with the smell of wet stone. Their lungs filled more easily, and for the first time since the collapse, they moved with something close to strength. But the earth was not finished with them. Halfway up the slope, the ground shook violently. The men staggered, some falling to their knees. A deep crack echoed through the chamber, and a section of ceiling broke loose. Boulders crashed down, one striking Morales across the back and pinning him to the ground. He cried out, dust rising in choking clouds. Help him, Ethan roared. They swarmed to Morales's side, straining against the stone. It was massive, immovable. Morales gasped, blood pooling beneath him. Panic spread through the group. Ethan pressed his shoulder against the rock, muscles straining until his vision blurred. Push, he bellowed. The men joined, grunting, groaning, sweat and tears mixing with dust. Slowly, agonizingly, the boulder shifted. Morales screamed as they dragged him free, his back torn and bleeding. He lay gasping, his eyes glassy with pain, but alive. Ethan knelt, pressing a hand to his shoulder. You're still with us. Stay that way. The others stared at Ethan, their chests heaving. No one spoke. The look in their eyes had changed. No longer doubt, no longer mere desperation. They looked at him as though he were the only thing holding the earth at bay. They carried Morales as they moved onward, their pace slower but steadier. Each man bore his share, lifting, supporting, refusing to leave anyone behind. For the first time, they were a unit, not a collection of frightened individuals. At last, they reached another chamber. Here the sound of water was louder, deafening. A cascade poured from an opening high in the rock, crashing into a pool that churned before flowing into another tunnel. The spray filled the air with mist, cool and clean. The men fell to their knees, drinking again, splashing their faces. Some laughed, others cried. Ethan stood apart, staring at the waterfall. It was beautiful in a way, the kind of sight he had once studied in books. But it was also a test. The tunnel where the water flowed might be a path upward, or a death trap. The men gathered around him, their eyes searching his face. "Well?" Reed asked softly. Ethan inhaled deeply. He could taste the fresh air, feel it filling his lungs. The water came from above, somewhere higher than here, perhaps even the surface. "It's our way," he said. There was no hesitation now, not even from Travis. Together, they stepped toward the torrent, into the mist and thunder, ready to risk everything for the promise of light. The waterfall roared like a living beast, its spray drenching them as they huddled at its base. The air was fresher here, almost sweet compared to the suffocating staleness of the lower tunnels. For the first time since the collapse, Ethan Cole could fill his lungs without feeling as though the mountain itself were squeezing the breath from him. He closed his eyes for a moment, savoring it, before the reality of their situation pressed back in. The torrent was no gift, it was a challenge. If they wanted freedom, they would have to climb through it. The men stared upward where the water spilled from a crack in the rock high above, vanishing into darkness. The opening was narrow, jagged, and slick. To climb it was to risk slipping into the pool below, where the current sucked everything toward a black tunnel that seemed to swallow water whole. One fall, and the river would claim them forever. Morales, pale and trembling from his injuries, whispered, "You think it leads out?" Ethan studied the fall, the angle of the water, the way the air rushed downward. He felt it on his skin, air moving with the water, a whisper from the world above. His heart surged. "It leads somewhere higher," he said. "That's more than we've had." Travis barked a humorless laugh. "So we drown faster, that's the plan?" But this time, no one echoed him. Reed shook his head, voice hoarse but firm. "Better to climb and fall than sit and choke. We follow Cole." The words settled over them like a verdict. Even Travis's sneer faltered, though his eyes burned with resentment. Ethan tested the wall first, gripping jagged edges with calloused hands, his boots finding purchase in the slick stone. The water hammered against him, soaking him to the bone, but his muscles locked steady. He climbed slowly, methodically, every inch upward hard-earned. When he reached a ledge halfway up, he looked down. "One at a time," he shouted over the roar. Hal came next, his thin frame trembling with effort. He slipped once, crying out, but Ethan's hand shot down, gripping his wrist and hauling him onto the ledge. One by one, the others followed, their bodies battered, their strength nearly gone, but their will carrying them upward. Travis came last, his jaw set tight, refusing Ethan's hand when it was offered. He pulled himself up with sheer stubbornness, collapsing on the ledge with a grunt. Above them, the crack continued, twisting upward. They climbed again, the water colder now, the stone cutting their palms. Time lost meaning. Their muscles screamed, their breath came ragged, but they climbed. At last, they dragged themselves into a narrow passage where the roar of the falls faded into echoes. The air here was fresher still. Ethan lifted his head, eyes narrowing. The ceiling sloped upward. Somewhere ahead, faint and impossibly fragile, he thought he saw it, a shimmer, a glow. "Light," he whispered. The word rippled through the men like fire. They surged forward, scraping their hands and knees raw on jagged stone as they crawled. The shimmer grew stronger until there was no mistaking it. Daylight, thin, filtered through cracks in the rock, but real. The sight stole the breath from their lungs. After endless darkness, the promise of the sun was enough to make grown men weep. But the path was blocked. A wall of collapsed stone sealed the passage, boulders wedged tightly together. Between the cracks, slivers of light spilled through, dazzling against their dust-caked faces. Freedom was inches away and utterly unreachable. For a moment, despair crushed them harder than any cave-in. Morales slumped to the ground, his head in his hands. Hal sobbed openly. Even Reed's shoulders sagged. Ethan pressed his palms against the rocks, his forehead resting against the cold stone. He could feel the faint whisper of air slipping through, cool and clean. The world was right there, taunting them. He drew a deep breath and turned. "We dig," he said. The men stared at him, hollow-eyed, broken. But slowly, one by one, they rose. Their hands were bleeding, their bodies wrecked, but they clawed at the stone with picks, shovels, even their bare fingers. Each scrape echoed like a drumbeat. They dug with desperation, with fury, with every ounce of strength left in their battered bodies. The air grew brighter as stones shifted. Dust filled their mouths, sweat blinded their eyes, but they did not stop. Ethan dug with them, his muscles burning, his knuckles torn open, blood mixing with dirt. He became a machine, driven by nothing but sheer will. At one point, Travis slumped back, gasping. His face was gray, his eyes dim. "We'll never make it," he rasped. Ethan turned on him, his voice like iron. "We're already dead if we stop." Something in his tone cut through Travis's bitterness. The man stared at him, then slowly dragged himself back to the wall and began clawing again. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed. The rocks shifted more easily now, smaller pieces breaking free. A shaft of light pierced the darkness, blinding them. A cry went up, ragged and wild. They dug faster, frantic, as though the light itself pulled them forward. Then it happened. A boulder tumbled loose, crashing outward, and a flood of sunlight poured in. The cavern filled with brilliance so bright they shielded their eyes, sobbing, laughing, shouting. For the first time, warmth touched their skin. Ethan staggered back, chest heaving, staring at the open crack. Beyond it lay trees, sky, the living world. He felt tears sting his eyes, though he had thought himself incapable of them anymore. But the earth was not finished. The opening was small, barely wide enough for one man at a time. They would have to squeeze through, and the rocks around it groaned ominously, as though warning them of another collapse. "We go," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the danger. "One at a time. Careful, steady." Hal went first, his small frame wriggling through the gap. His cry of wonder on the other side made the men weep with relief. Morales followed, Reed after him, each man dragging himself into the light. Ethan stayed back, guiding them, steadying the rocks when they shifted. Travis hesitated at the crack. He looked at Ethan, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then Travis muttered, "If we make it out, Cole, I'll owe you." He squeezed through and was gone. Ethan was last. He pressed his hands against the wall, feeling the stone tremble. He knew it might collapse once he forced his way through, sealing the tunnel forever. But he also knew it no longer mattered. He had brought them here. He had given them a chance. With a grunt, he shoved himself forward, squeezing through the jagged crack. Stone scraped his back, tore at his clothes. For a terrifying moment, he was wedged, trapped between earth and freedom. Then, with a final desperate push, he burst into the light. The world greeted him with a rush of air so clean it burned his lungs, with sunlight that blinded his eyes, with the sound of birdsong he had thought never to hear again. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, laughing, weeping. Around him, the others did the same, their faces lifted to the sky. They had made it. Against all odds, they had clawed their way from the abyss to the light. But even as they celebrated, Ethan knew the mountain had not given them freedom. They had taken it, piece by piece, with blood and will. The stone had tested them, and it had nearly won. The sunlight was blinding. After days in the suffocating dark, it seared their eyes until tears streamed down their cheeks, but none of the men looked away. They sat sprawled in the grass beyond the jagged opening they had clawed from the mountain, their chests heaving as though they could never get enough of the air. Every breath was a gift, every lungful a miracle. The sky above stretched vast and endless, a blue they had almost forgotten existed. Birds wheeled in that endless dome, their calls sharp and sweet, and for the first time, the men wept openly without shame. Ethan Cole knelt apart from the others, his broad shoulders bent as he stared down at his hands. The skin was torn, his knuckles shredded, his nails broken to the quick, all caked in blood and dirt. They did not look like hands, they looked like claws, carved by the mountain itself. He flexed them slowly, each movement sending lances of pain up his arms. But beneath the pain was a strange wonder. Those ruined hands had carried them all here. Behind him, Morales lay on his back, staring at the sky with a dazed smile despite the blood soaking his shirt. Reed sat hunched, trembling but alive, whispering prayers under his breath. Hal laughed too loudly, almost hysterical, clutching fistfuls of grass as though afraid the earth might pull him back. Even Travis, silent and pale, stared at the horizon with something like awe in his hard eyes. They were alive. The moment did not last. Shouts carried across the trees, urgent voices cutting through the stillness. Figures emerged, rescuers, helmets gleaming in the sun, eyes wide with disbelief as they spotted the ragged group. The men surged forward, shouting, waving, stumbling on unsteady legs. The rescuers rushed to meet them, their faces etched with shock and relief. "God Almighty," one of them breathed. "We thought you were gone." The whole shaft collapsed. "We've been digging blind for days." Hands reached out, steadying the survivors, pressing canteens of water into their shaking fingers, wrapping blankets around shoulders raw from stone. Questions flew, frantic, but the men were too stunned, too drained to answer. They only clung to their rescuers as though afraid the mountain might snatch them back. Ethan remained where he was, kneeling in the grass, watching as the others were gathered up. The rescuers turned to him at last, pulling him to his feet. He stumbled, his body protesting, but their arms steadied him. He felt the weight of their eyes, the unspoken question. How had they survived? How had they clawed their way out when the mountain had swallowed them whole? He had no words. He only shook his head, his throat tight. They were led down the slope to where vehicles waited, engines idling. News had already spread. There were cameras, reporters, flashes that burned brighter than the sun. Voices clamored, microphones thrust forward. "How did you escape? What happened down there? Who led you out?" The men shielded their eyes, dazed, but one by one, they turned to Ethan. Morales raised a trembling hand, pointing. "Him," he croaked. "Ethan Cole. He saved us." The words rippled through the group. Reed nodded fiercely. Hal's voice cracked as he echoed. "He's the reason we're here. He found the way. He carried us." The reporters seized on it, their cameras swinging toward Ethan. He froze, the sudden attention cutting into him like a blade. For years he had been invisible, mocked as rough, dismissed as nothing more than muscle. Now dozens of eyes burned into him, searching for the story, the miracle. He wanted to retreat, to vanish back into the stone. Travis stepped forward then, his face pale, his body trembling. The man who had fought him at every turn, who had mocked and resisted, now met his gaze. His voice was low, hoarse, but clear. "He's the reason we're alive." He was the only one who knew. "We owe him everything." Ethan stared at him, stunned. For a heartbeat, he thought he must have misheard. But the sincerity in Travis's eyes left no room for doubt. The mountain had broken many things, but it had forged this truth. The reporters surged closer, shouting questions, cameras flashing. Ethan raised a hand, his voice quiet but carrying. "It wasn't me. It was all of us. We dug together. We survived together. No man comes out of a mountain alone." But even as he said it, he knew the others would not let the credit go. They shook their heads, their eyes fixed on him with something more powerful than gratitude. Reverence. The ride back to town blurred into a haze. The survivors were carried into hospitals, their bodies prodded, their wounds cleaned. Doctors spoke in hushed tones of malnutrition, dehydration, trauma. Family members wept as they clung to them, their cries echoing in the sterile halls. Reporters swarmed outside, the story spreading like wildfire. Miracle survivors of the collapse, led to safety by a miner turned hero. Ethan Cole, from brute to savior. The headlines burned across every screen, every paper. People he had never met spoke his name, their voices heavy with awe. But Ethan could not feel like a hero. Alone in the hospital room at night, he stared at the ceiling, haunted by the faces of those who had not made it, men whose voices had gone silent in the first collapse. He remembered dragging bodies free only to realize they no longer breathed. He remembered the weight of the stone pressing in, the terror in the eyes of the men who had looked to him for answers. Heroes were men untouched by doubt, by fear. He was only a man who had refused to stop moving. Yet when Morales was wheeled past his room, his eyes caught Ethan's, shining with gratitude despite the pain. When Reed clasped his hand with tears streaking his face, whispering, You gave me my life back. Ethan felt something shift inside him. Perhaps being a hero wasn't about feeling worthy. Perhaps it was simply about standing when others could not. Days passed. The men healed slowly, their bodies scarred but alive. Reporters begged for interviews. Ethan refused most, speaking only when the others pressed him. He told the truth each time, that he had only followed the stone, that the men's strength had carried them out. But the world wanted a story, and they made him one. At last, the day came when they gathered at the site of the collapse. The mine mouth was sealed now, timbers splintered, and earth piled high. A memorial stood where families had laid flowers for the dead. The survivors stood together, their faces solemn, their bodies still healing. Ethan stepped forward, his boots sinking into the soil. He stared at the scar in the earth, remembering the roar, the darkness, the suffocating fear. He remembered clawing at the stone until his hands bled, dragging men back from the brink, refusing to surrender even when his body screamed. He placed a calloused hand on the memorial stone, his eyes closing. The crowd watched in silence. He spoke softly, more to the earth than to the people. You tested us. You tried to bury us. But we are still here. When he turned, the men stood behind him, their faces lined but resolute. They nodded, one by one. Morales, Reed, Hal, even Travis. They had gone into the dark together, and they had come back forged in fire and stone. The reporters asked again if he considered himself a hero. Ethan shook his head. No, the mountain made us fight for every breath. We only survived because we fought together. Call me whatever you want, but remember their names too. Every man who stood beside me is the reason we are here. The words settled over the crowd, and for once, the questions stopped. There was only silence, and in that silence, respect. That night, Ethan returned home. His small house felt strange, too quiet after the echoes of the tunnels. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the worn textbooks he had once left behind. Geological maps, notes scribbled in the margins. He traced a finger across the pages, memories flooding back. For years, he had thought that life was lost, buried under duty and survival. But in the heart of the mountain, in the darkest place, he had found it again. Not as a scholar, not as a dreamer, but as a man who had read the earth and lived. He closed the book, his lips curving into a faint smile. He was no longer the brute they had once mocked. He was something more, something the stone itself had carved. When he stepped outside, the night sky stretched vast above him, stars glittering like quartz in the dark. He breathed deeply, the air cool and clean. For the first time in years, his chest felt light. The stone had tested him, and he had proven stronger.